Have you ever wondered how fear and prejudice can shape the course of history? Well, let's take a journey back in time to a moment in history that starkly illustrates this reality. The year was 1942, amidst the throes of World War II, when the United States government enacted Executive Order 9066. This policy, born amidst a climate of fear and prejudice, led to the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were native-born U.S. citizens. But what were the forces that shaped this policy? How did fear and prejudice intertwine to create such a dark chapter in American history? Let's start by setting the stage. The U.S. had just suffered a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, which thrust the nation into a state of war hysteria. Fear was rampant, and this fear, coupled with long-standing racial prejudice against Japanese Americans, created a potent mix that influenced policymaking at the highest levels. The result? Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which authorized the Secretary of War to prescribe military areas, leading to the internment of Japanese Americans. It was a policy that was not born solely out of military necessity, but was also shaped by the undercurrents of fear and prejudice that were prevalent during this period. But how did this happen? How did these elements of fear and prejudice become so intertwined with policymaking? Well, that's where the complexity of this historical event truly lies. It's an intricate web of emotions, decisions, and actions that ultimately led to a significant and regrettable violation of civil liberties. So how did these elements of fear, prejudice, and policy intertwine to form this dark chapter in history? Let's dive deeper. We'll explore the war hysteria that swept the nation post-Pearl Harbor, the racial prejudice that underpinned societal attitudes towards Japanese Americans, and the specifics of Executive Order 9066, a policy born of these turbulent times. Join us as we journey through this intricate maze of history, seeking lessons from the past to inform our present and future. Imagine the climate post-Pearl Harbor. The nation was in a grip of war hysteria. The date was December 7, 1941. The tranquility of a Hawaiian morning was shattered as Japanese forces launched an attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The assault was swift, brutal, and unexpected. In its wake lay devastation. Over 2,000 American lives lost and a nation's sense of security irreparably damaged. This singular event plunged the United States into the throes of World War II and triggered a wave of fear and mistrust that swept across the country. The American psyche, already strained by the ongoing war, was now under the added pressure of a direct attack on home soil. A sense of vulnerability and fear permeated society, leading to a state of war hysteria. This hysteria was not just a collective emotional response, it was a powerful force that began to shape government policy. In the midst of this climate, the wheels of bureaucracy turned, and on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 into law. This order gave the military broad powers to ban any citizen from a 50 to 60-mile wide coastal area stretching from Washington state to California and extending inland into southern Arizona. The order also authorized the transport of these citizens to assembly centers hastily constructed in California, Arizona, Washington state, and Oregon. But let's take a step back and examine this a bit closer. It is important to understand that while the war hysteria post-Pearl Harbor did play a significant role in the creation of Executive Order 9066, it was not the sole driving force. The climate was ripe for the seeds of prejudice to take root, and they did, influencing the course of policy and ultimately leading to one of the most controversial decisions in American history. Indeed, war hysteria played a significant role, but it was not the only factor. Prejudice, too, had a part to play. Let's delve into that in our next chapter. While war hysteria was rampant, another dark undercurrent was at play: racial prejudice. In the tempestuous sea of government policy during World War II, this undercurrent was a driving force behind Executive Order 9066. Racial prejudice is not a new concept. It has been a part of human history for centuries. However, in the early 20th century, this prejudice took on a particularly sinister form, shaping policies and leading to actions that were unjust and inhumane. Nowhere was this more evident than in the case of Japanese Americans, who were subjected to unimaginable hardship and suffering due to their ethnic background. In the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, they were unjustly targeted, suspected of being enemy sympathizers simply because of their ancestry. Existing biases and stereotypes were amplified by war hysteria, leading to the belief that Japanese Americans posed a significant threat to national security. This racial prejudice was so deep-seated that it overrode logic and reason, painting all people of Japanese descent with the same broad brush. It was this prejudice that played a significant role in the enactment of Executive Order 9066. The order, which authorized the internment of Japanese Americans, was not just the product of military necessity. It was also a reflection of the racial prejudice that was prevalent at the time. It was a policy born out of fear and bias rather than rational thought and consideration. This dark undercurrent of racial prejudice did not just shape policy, it also shaped public opinion. It created an environment of fear and suspicion, where Japanese Americans were viewed as the other, as potential threats to be feared and mistrusted. The role of racial prejudice in the enactment of Executive Order 9066 is a stark reminder of the damage that such bias can cause. It is a reminder that in times of crisis, it is not just military considerations that shape policy, but also the biases and prejudices that exist within society. With war hysteria and racial prejudice playing their parts, the stage was set for the enactment of a policy that would leave a lasting impact. Let this serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchallenged prejudice and the importance of fostering understanding and tolerance in its stead. In the midst of this fear and prejudice, a policy was born, Executive Order 9066. This was the United States government's response to the hysteria that had gripped the nation following the attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the order on February 19, 1942, setting into motion a chain of events that would profoundly impact the lives of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066 granted the U.S. military the authority to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. While the order did not specifically mention Japanese Americans, it was used as a tool to target and displace them from their homes on the West Coast. Deemed potential threats to national security, these individuals, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps scattered across the country's interior. The internment camps were hardly a home away from home. Families were separated, personal property was lost, and the living conditions were harsh. Yet those interned maintained their dignity, forging communities within the camps and enduring the experience with resilience. This policy, born of fear and prejudice, resulted in grave human rights violations. Despite the lack of any concrete evidence of espionage or sabotage, Japanese Americans were subjected to this mass incarceration solely based on their ethnic heritage. The impact reached far beyond the physical internment, leaving deep psychological scars and a legacy of injustice that resonates to this day. It wasn't until December 1944 that the Supreme Court ruled the detention unconstitutional, and the last of the camps were closed by the end of 1945. However, the damage had been done, and the repercussions of Executive Order 9066 continue to be felt. As we reflect on this dark chapter in our history, we are reminded of the power of fear and prejudice and the potential for them to infiltrate policymaking. It serves as a stark warning of the dangers of compromising human rights in the name of national security. Thus, Executive Order 9066 stands as a stark example of how fear and prejudice can shape policy, leading to grave injustices. History often serves as our greatest teacher, offering us lessons for a more just and compassionate future. And so, as we conclude our journey through the depths of history, we must reflect upon the critical lessons learned from Executive Order 9066. We've seen how war hysteria in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor stirred the pot of policy, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty. This hysteria, coupled with long-standing racial prejudice, created a storm of discrimination against Japanese Americans, culminating in their unjust internment. This policy wasn't just the result of military necessity, but rather it was shaped by emotions, fear, prejudice, and irrationality. The dark undercurrent of racial bias played a significant role, painting Japanese Americans as the enemy, despite their innocence. Executive Order 9066 serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when fear and prejudice dictate policy. It underscores the importance of reason, fairness, and justice in the formation of our laws and regulations. But let's not dwell merely on the darkness of this chapter. Let's use it to illuminate our path towards a more compassionate future. Let's learn from our past mistakes, ensuring that no community is ever again subjected to such grave injustice. Let's strive for a world where every creed, every race, is respected and given an equal place. Let's foster tolerance and understanding, overthrowing prejudice with the light of knowledge. In times of crisis, let's allow wisdom and fairness to guide us, not fear. Let's promote discourse that is informed and serene, where truth prevails and insights are gleaned. Let's empower every voice, fostering a world where fairness rings in every policy. May we remember Executive Order 9066, not as a dark chapter to be forgotten, but as a powerful lesson for future generations. For a just, compassionate world we hold dear. Let's walk in the light of wisdom, shaping a world where justice flows like a river, and peace and understanding grow.